I want to see how quickly I can get off a response here to Fred and his video called Rational and Irrational Freedom. And I think, the first part of that video, maybe the first 5 minutes of it, I really enjoyed. I was right on with. And the second half, I wasn't so much critical of as much as I want to take it in a different way. And so I'm going to see if I can't first say a couple things about what Fred was talking about and then talk about a different way to come at it. So he was suggesting that there does seem to be a difference between what we would call the kind of freedom or the will as it's exercised in a calm, cool, premeditative or rational way, where I think in this is what we're talking about, that kind of encumbrance where there's a freedom to, but that freedom to only, emerges, I guess, as you deliberate over possibilities in a kind of detached way. But that's very different than the kind of what we call an act of passion, perhaps, someone being driven from something internally. If there's an internal constraint or an external constraint, we say that the person really doesn't have, or that their will has been compromised. They don't have a true expression of their will. But he was giving these sort of, if you do a dance, or if you look at the way the person dances or moves, or they're trying to give an articulate gesture, if there's an external constraint on there, you can see it, again, sort of being blocked, and they're not having an adequate release in the freedom from those outward constraints. And then, that's sort of how he's dealing with the way that we talk about it in terms of inner constraint and outer constraint, and then it's those things that are kind of detached that we assign as something like of the will. And those are some of the issues that he's talking about. But then he moves in the second half toward this notion of the spatial metaphors that we have for freedom, and how freedom seems to have this sense of futuralness, where we look out there and there are possibilities and we can see from options among them. And I thought it was interesting as well how he, in other videos, I think it was a recent video, Fred had talked about the way that some Indians conceive of the past as ahead of them, and they use the future is somehow behind them, and they sort of like walking backward. You sort of walk backward into the future while facing the past. And he gave an illustration of that and started to walk backward, and then at a moment went, well, I better turn around or I'm going to stumble. And at that very moment when he thought, I better be careful, I'm going to stumble, he was in fact at that moment doing what the Midori Indians actually do. I'm not sure if that was the Indian, but what those Indians actually do, which was a knowing that is drawing from the past and using the past as a way to see the future. In some way, the sight of his mind's eye was the seeing of the past through the possible future. It really was interesting. But anyway, I think that there really are wonderful spatial metaphors, and the way that he was relying upon Mark Johnson, I think Johnson's work is so good, and there is so much to be had in terms of spatial metaphors. Okay, I wouldn't go that way though, Fred. I think there a different way to cut at it. I would say it would here be a different way. That isn't this also part of it, that we do reduce time to space, and we have spatial metaphors like ahead of us and behind us, and ahead of us is possibilities, but the past has a trail that now has been carved. And I think there's a lot to be said in that. But there's also multi-generationality in terms of different ages always being simultaneous to now. That is, every person is in the now, and yet there are babies, there are people who are younger, there are people who are older, there are people who are aged, and there's always people who are older than you and younger than you. And so we experience time in space, not simply spatial. It's in space in the sense that people are multi-generational in their very being. That is, I'm never just one age to the extent that my age is relative to others. And I guess the way that this bears upon your initial discussion about passion and rationality is that I think there's almost an inversion that occurs in some of the things that you were talking about, because there is a sense in which a child, and this critical issue of, when are people old enough to become able to decide for themselves, to be reasonable, and then how is it that societal imposition and blockage is what liberates a person into that kind of cool, detached, and maybe various forms of rational strategy for dealing with one's passions. But it does seem like, there are forms of socialization, and whether it's hugging and forms of community and connection and support and love and all kinds of things that help a person get resources for, and again, it's literacy and it's other things, but for not acting viciously, for not acting, again, it's, I guess, how do I say it? I think it's because we're multi-generational that some of that distinction between the passion and the rationality becomes difficult, because the same act, the older person is sort of like have the advantage of time over you and can give you a rationality over your passions when you're young, and it gives you a kind of a way of learning how to be rational to yourself, but by taking advantage of their accumulated time to do so, the reflection that they bring. I think because part of our being is being for others in this sort of Sartrean sense, that we do have a whole, like, dimension of our being which is for others, and it is multidimensional, and it's gendered, and it's raced, and it's classed, and has all these other characteristics, that I think it does seem that time and free will are very interconnected, but they're also maybe interconnected intersubjectively and socially, in that we depend upon others' constraints in order to become individually free. Something like that. So, okay, thanks for that video. I really enjoyed it. Hope you're well. Okay, bye.